The Rock and Roll Unravelled Show. I'm Derek Shelmerdine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unravelled Show. The 23rd of May is the 50th anniversary of the UK release of The Who's Tommy, released on the 23rd of May 1969. So today I thought we'd take a look at The Who and particularly focus on the Keith Moon years. Now the road to The Who's really quite an interesting one. Pete Townshend and John Entwistle, well, they came back together toward the end of the 1950s, and they were in a trad jazz band called the Confederates, where John Entwistle played French horn and trumpet, and Pete Townshend played the banjo. They were also in the Aristocrats and the Scorpions before they hooked up with Roger Daltrey in the Detours. Now, by late 1963, the band was Roger Daltrey, guitar and vocals, John Entwistle, bass, Pete Townshend guitar, and Doug Sandham on drums. And a big night in Pete Townshend's life came on the 22nd of December 1963, when the Detours were supporting the Rolling Stones at Putney's St Mary's Hall, that's in West London. An urban legend has it that Pete Townshend saw Keith Richard stretch his arm high above his head just as the curtains were about to open. And Pete Townshend thought, "Ooh, I like that, I'll have a bit of that." And his trademark swinging arm motion was born that night. And 6 weeks or so later, on the 1st of February, Johnny Delvin and the Detours appeared on Thank You Lucky Stars, UK TV programme. Now that's very different, Detours, and they galvanised Roger Daltrey and the boys to change their name from the Detours to The Who. Now the 9th of April 64 wasn't a particularly good one for The Who. They had an audition for Fontana, and then later the same day they auditioned again for BBC Radio, and they failed both auditions, sadly. For Fontana, they auditioned for A&R man Chris Parmenter, and he identified Doug Sandham as a weak link in the band, and he had to go, basically. And after 2 years with the group, he was on his bike. He left. Now that's a very, very similar story to Pete Best and how he came to leave the Beatles. Pete Best was the drummer with the Beatles when they went for their first recording session for Love Me Do at EMI's Parlophone record label. And George Martin was the producer, and he felt that Pete Best should go. And out he went. In came Ringo, and the Fab Four lineup of the Beatles was there. Now, The Who's name was very fluid at this time, and they auditioned for Fontana as The Who, but by the time their Fontana single came out, they were the high numbers. And when Pete Townshend applied to the BBC for an audition, he did so as the Detours. On the day, they auditioned as The Who, which I'm sure was very confusing for all concerned. So the hunt was on to find a new drummer, and various people had a go to replace Doug Sandham. Brian Redman was there, ex-Foremost, Mersey Beat band, well, a very successful Mersey Beat band. And future Jimi Hendrix Experience drummer Mitch Mitchell, he also tried out for The Who. That would have been a very different band with Mitch Mitchell. So somewhere in a parallel universe, well, by the end of April 64, Keith Moon himself auditioned for The Who. And by the time he did his audition, The Who were already a well-established London band. So looking at Keith Moon, he was born on the 23rd of August 1946 in Wembley, North London. He was actually the youngest member of the group. He was with various bands before The Who, people like Mark Twain and the Strangers, the Beachcombers. And on the 25th of June 62, he famously approached Carlo Little backstage at a Screaming Lord Sutch gig, and he approached him for some drum lessons. Now, Carlo Little was an interesting guy, as well as Screaming Lord Sutch and various other bands. He also was a regular drummer with the Rolling Stones. That's until Charlie Watts took over the position permanently. And on the 5th of September, Keith Moon and his band Mark Twain and the Strangers, they failed an audition for the BBC Light programme. They lost out to another London band, the Dead Clock 5. Keith Moon went on to join the Beachcombers, but in between, in the spring of '63, he actually auditioned for Shane Fenton and the Fentones, well-respected band at the time, and he lost out to the Hollies and Bobby Elliott. Now, Shane Fenton famously reinvented himself a little later as Alvin Stardust. The end of April 1964, Keith Moon auditioned for The Who at the Oldfield Hotel in Greenford, London, and they played Bo Diddley's Roadrunner. A urban legend has it that he destroyed the bass pedal during his very brief time on stage. Now, Roadrunner was written by E. McDaniel, better known as Bo Diddley. It gave him an R&B number 20 in 1960, and this is the original. This is the Bo Diddley version of Roadrunner. Well, the classic lineup was in place. Guitarist Pete Townsend, singer Roger Daltrey, bassist John Entwistle, and of course, drummer Keith Moon. They were the Who. On the 5th of May 1964, they had their second audition for Fantana, again with A&R man Chris Parmenter, but this time drummer Doug Sandham had been replaced by Keith Moon, and this led to their first single, Zoot Suit, coupled with I'm the Face. And by the time it was released, they were no longer the Who, they were now calling themselves the High Numbers. And it was in the summer of '64 that the Who met Peter Meaden, and he was very prominent in the mod movement, and he created the group's mod image and changed their name to the High Numbers. He thought that sounded a little cooler. And it was the 3rd of July that they released Zoot Suit and I'm the Face, both sides actually written by Peter Meaden, and it was promoted as the first authentic mod record. And the 16th of August was a great night to be in Blackpool. Well, more specifically, to be in Blackpool Opera House, where the High Numbers were supporting the Beatles at Harold Fielding's Sunday night at the Blackpool Opera House. And the middle of the show was a veritable mod fest. The Kinks closed the first half, and the High Numbers opened up after the interval. What a night that would have been. And another red letter day for the Who came on the 24th of November, when they had their first of their Tuesday night residencies at London's Marquee Club. And a couple of months later, middle of January '65, they released their first UK single, I Can't Explain. Now, the jury's out as to whether Jimmy Page actually performed on the record, but the Ivy League definitely provided the background vocals. And that October, they released My Generation, that for a long time was the culmination of their set, when they would absolutely destroy their instruments and equipment on stage. I saw them in that era. Absolutely unbelievable. Now, My Generation was written by Pete Townsend, and it was essentially the last single produced by Shel Talmy and engineered by Glyn Johns, who pops up all over the place when you're unraveling rock and roll. Now, the band, The Who, were a little on the volatile side, and on the 19th of November '65, Roger Daltrey stormed off stage mid-performance. He had a right little paddy. Earlier in the day, they performed live on Ready, Steady, Go, fabulous British pop music, well, rock music TV show. And then they rushed over to Wembley Empire Pool, as it was then, to appear at the Glad Rag Ball. And there were around 3,000 people in the hall when the Who took to the stage. And they actually used the hall's own PA equipment. And once the performance started, Roger Daltrey took a very dim view of the quality of the sound that was emanated from said PA equipment. So off he went, stormed off the stage, and the Who's road crew set up the band's own equipment while the other band members carried on playing. And once the sound system was in place, back he came. Roger was back on stage, and they continued with the concert. And on the 6th of December, Keith Moon spent, well, what was not the only time when he wasn't playing drums for the Who. He was substituted this time for about 10 days by Viv Prince when he was forced really through a spot of illness to take a break from live performances. Viv Prince had recently been sacked from the Pretty Things around this time. But to come the 17th of December, Mooney was back on the drum seat. And it was 1966 when they split with Shel Talmy in Brunswick, and Kit Lambert became their producer. And that really all sort of came about in the March of 66 with Substitute, when they coupled it with Instant Party on their new Reaction record label. Now, it's quite a long and complicated story, that of Substitute, and I told it before in the Cream story. So if you want to hear the whole story of Substitute, worth checking out, just go to my website at rockandrollandravel.com and have a look for the podcast and have a listen to the Cream story. But in essence, Shel Talmy produced all their Brunswick singles, and they'd already recorded this B-side to their first Reaction single, Instant Party, while they were at Brunswick. Now, Shel Talmy not very happy at all about the situation, and he released a Brunswick single, Legal Matter, coupled with the Instant Party version they recorded there. And he also obtained an injunction which stopped the Who from selling Substitute and also prevented them from recording, to get over the problem, because they really didn't want Substitute crashing and burning out of the charts. So they re-released Substitute with a new B-side, Waltz for a Pig. And Waltz for a Pig was credited to the Who Orchestra, which was in fact the Graham Bond organisation. And at that time, Ginger Baker was the drummer. Well, for a long time, Ginger Baker was the drummer of the Graham Bond organisation. And he also wrote the B-side, Waltz for a Pig. And a similar situation now with the next event on the 16th of May, just a little bit later. Jeff Beck was recording Beck's Bolero. He was still with the Yardbirds at the time, but he decided to go off, and a couple of the people who were with him that day were Keith Moon and Jimmy Page. But again, it's quite a complicated story, Beck's Bolero, a lot of interesting twists and turns on it. And I told that one in the How Led Zeppelin Came Together show, Rock and Roll Unravelled show, relatively recently. So again, to have a listen to the whole story of Beck's Bolero, check out the podcast for How Led Zeppelin Came Together on rockandrollandravel.com. Now, it was around this time that Keith Moon and John Entwistle were really not very happy at The Who, and they were talking to Jimmy Page about maybe forming a band, and described it as so heavy it would be like go down like a Led Zeppelin, and that was an expression they tended to use when a Who gig was going badly. Now, in the summer of 68, Jimmy Page was reforming the new Yardbirds, and in November they gigged for the first time as Led Zeppelin. And in that other podcast, you can hear some of the twists and turns on how that name came about. Now, 4 days after the Beck's Bolero recording, Keith Moon and John Entwistle actually quit the Who. They'd arrived late for a Who gig at Newbury's Rickety Tick Club. They stayed a little bit longer than planned at the Ready Steady Go party, so they were also having a very fine time there. But by the time they arrived at the gig, Roger Daltrey and Pete Townshend had already started the set. And what they did, they used the rhythm section from the support band. So that would have been a great time for them. Feelings ran very high. And towards the end, there was an on-stage altercation during the equipment smashing My Generation finale. And apparently left Keith Moon with a black eye. And Moon and Entwistle quit the band that night. I mean, John Entwistle returned to the fold fairly shortly afterwards, but Keith Moon was out for a week. And during his absence, his place was taken by the local drummer every night. But when he did return, he was back with his new Premier double bass drum kit. Shortly after that, they embarked on their infamous German tour, and they were supported by John's Children, and Mark Bolan was a member of the group. He'd recently joined the band, and they opened for the Who. Now, John's Children were well known for their outrageous stage show, and on the 12th of April, the tour reached the Friedrich Eberts-Halle in Ludwigshafen, and the concert descended into a full-blown riot. And so much so that the Who kicked them off the tour and back to Blighty they went. Now, for the Who to think that John's children's antics were a little boisterous, wow, that must have been some performance. And once again, Keith Moon was on the subs bench. On the 29th of May, he was replaced by Julian Covey after an incident at Oxford University's May Ball, where he threw the drums so hard he gave himself a hernia. And Julian Covey, of course, was Julian Covey and the Machine and Brian Auger Trinity. He was only there for just the one gig at Glasgow's Locarno Ballroom and unavailable to cover again. So they went back to John's Children, and Chris Townsend, John's Children drummer, played on for the next 4 gigs. But they got their own back for the German tour. On the last gig, the Who used a whole bunch of flash powder in the bass drum, and they wanted to make sure that Townsend's last gig went off with a bang. In the summer of '67, of course, was the birth of rock festivals. The legendary Monterey International Pop Festival in California was in the summer of love 1967, from the 16th to the 18th of June. Although that was not actually technically the first rock festival. That accolade tends to be given to the Fantasy Fair and Magic Mountain Music Festival, great name, just a week earlier. And that was at Mount Tamalpais, just north of San Francisco. Now, the Who and Jimi Hendrix appeared on the third day, and famously both refused to follow the other on stage. Toss of a coin put the Who on first, and they obviously did a storming, equipment smashing performance. And then Jimi Hendrix came on. I mean, he was making his American debut in a feedback-laden version of Wild Thing. He set fire to his guitar. Well, it came as a bit of a surprise to the American audience. And he smashed the guitar into the stage until it snapped, and he threw the neck into the audience. Now there's a piece of rock and roll memorabilia. But their performance there led to an invitation to support the Monkees on their current American tour. But that's an interesting story in itself. The festival itself, Monterey, broke the Who and Jimi Hendrix, and of course Janis Joplin in the US. That was when their careers on the other side of the pond all really started to take off. Now, the 28th of June '67, they recorded The Last Time and Under My Thumb, a couple of Jagger and Richards compositions. And they recorded them to show solidarity with Mick and Keith, who were facing jail sentences for drug possession. Jagger had been found guilty already, and Richards was up in court the following day. Now, only 3 of the Who appear on the record because John Entwistle was away on his honeymoon, enjoying himself. And Pete Townsend, in his absence, did the honours on bass guitar. Now, The Last Time was a hit for the Rolling Stones in 1965. It gave them a number 1. And in 1967, it gave the Who a number 44. But this is the Who's version of The Last Time. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with the Rock and Roll Unravelled show. The 23rd of May '69 was the day that Tommy was released, and we're celebrating the 50th anniversary with the story of the Who and the Keith Moon years. But before continuing with the story, an opportunity to win a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. Last month's competition was won by Andrew from Liverpool. Well done, mate. A signed copy of Rock and Roll Unravelled will be with you very shortly. To win yourself a signed copy of Rock and Roll Unravelled, this month's question: who did Keith Moon replace as drummer in The Who? Now, the book, a signed copy of the book, could be winging its way to you, and Rock and Roll Unravelled tells a story of rock and roll from its roots through to mid-1970s punk. And that question again: who did Keith Moon replace as drummer in The Who? Now, to enter, simply go to my website, rockandrollunraveled.com, go to contacts, send me an email with your answer, and the winner will be announced on the next show, 3rd of June, and I'll post the book to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Well, good luck with the competition. Meanwhile, back at the plot, well, Tommy may have been released in the May of '69, but the story of Tommy goes back to 1967 and an aeroplane incident on the 14th of August, and that inspired a song called Glow Girl. Now, Glow Girl in turn inspired It's a Boy and Tommy. During their American tour, the Who's plane developed some engine troubles on a flight from Rhode Island to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Now, this resulted in a nerve-wracking journey for the band and an emergency landing for the plane. And the experience inspired songwriter Pete Townsend to pen the plane crash song Glow Girl. Now, Glow Girl was intended to be released as a single, also pegged as the opener for the album Who's for Tennis. That was a planned follow-up to the Who Sell Out. Now, the song was never released as a single, and Who's for Tennis never materialised either. That was replaced by Direct Hits in the UK and Magic Bus, The Who on Tour in America. Now, Glow Girl contains the line, "It's a girl, Mrs. Walker," and Tommy opens with the overture, followed by "It's a boy," also for Mrs. Walker. Glow Girl was finally released, though, on the Who's 1974 album, Hot and Sods. But one of the greatest pieces of television you'll ever come across, rock music television, was the Smothers Brothers comedy hour on the 17th of September. And it ends with an equipment smashing My Generation, a huge explosion from the flash powder in Keith Moon's bass drum. Now, urban legend has it that Moon encouraged the stagehand to considerably increase the amount of flash powder stuffed into the bass drum. And Pete Townsend was busy smashing his guitar on the floor right in front of the bass drum when it all went off with some force, and he took the full force of the explosion on the side of his head. On a slightly lighter note, a year or so later, November 1968, Keith Moon was bantering with a magistrate, as one does, and he'd been fined £2 for being drunk and disorderly. And when handing out the sentence, the magistrate admonished Moon with, "Now, we don't want you playing in the traffic anymore, Mr. Moon." To which Keith replied, "Absolutely, they already have a drummer." The beginning of May saw the premiere of Tommy at Ronnie Scott's Jazz Club in London, and that was actually 3 weeks before its UK release on the 23rd of May. Now, it's often cited as the first rock opera, but the Pretty Things SF Sorrow was released in the UK on the 20th of December 1968. So, room for discussion, I think, over the first rock opera. Now, in the autumn of '67, art director of the International Times, their well-known underground newspaper stroke magazine, Mike McInnery, he introduced Pete Townsend to the works of Indian avatar Meher Baba. Townsend became a keen follower of Baba, and Tommy was inspired by his teachings. In 1925, Meher Baba took a vow of silence, and he maintained that until his death in 1969. Mike McInnery also has a more direct link with Tommy. He's the guy who designed the sleeve for the album. Now, 1968, the Christmas TV special that never was. On the 11th of December, the Rolling Stones recorded their Rock and Roll Circus. And that was actually, sadly, Brian Jones's last live performance. Now, the acts included John Lennon's Dirty Mac, which featured Keith Richards on bass, Eric Clapton, Mitch Mitchell. And that was John Lennon's first appearance outside the Beatles. And also performing that particular show was Jethro Tull with guitarist Tony Iommi. Now, Tony Iommi had recently joined from Earth, and he was only with Jethro Tull for a very short period, just about long enough to record Rock and Roll Circus. And he went back to Earth, and they became Black Sabbath. And The Who, of course, performed there. They performed a quick one, While He's Away. And urban myth has it that Mick Jagger didn't sanction release at the time because he thought they'd been very much upstaged by The Who, but it did get a DVD release in 1996. And one of the strangest stories in rock and roll comes from the 4th of January 1970, when Keith Moon supposedly ran over his own driver. Well, maybe, maybe not. The whole thing's really shrouded in mystery as to what happened, who was driving. What we do know is that Keith opened a disco at the Red Lion pub in Hatfield, Hertfordshire. And as he was leaving, there was a contretemps with some local youths. Now, some say that Yobbs was throwing pennies and kicking his Bentley, and driver Neil Boland got out of the car to confront them. Accounts vary dramatically as to what happened next. Neil Boland ended up under the car as it drove away. Now, he was taken to hospital but pronounced dead on arrival. Now, Keith claimed he was driving, but eyewitness accounts dispute this, and I suppose we'll never really get to the bottom of that particular event. But a month later, Valentine's Day, The Who were at Leeds University recording their Live at Leeds concert. It was very nearly live at Hull. The Hull concert at the City Hall the following night was also recorded, but they had problems with the sound quality. Now, Live at Leeds was released with memorabilia inserts in a sort of mock bootleg sleeve, similar to the cover of the Rolling Stones' Liver Than You'll Ever Be album. Now, the original vinyl album each contained 6 songs, and the performance of Tommy that particular night didn't get released until 2001 on the 2-CD deluxe edition. Now, the Leeds Civic Trust awarded the event a blue plaque, so that's gone down in history, both rock and roll and otherwise. And on the 7th of June, The Who were opening their latest American tour at the New York Metropolitan Opera House. And the posters billed the event as The Who in the final performance of their rock opera Tommy. Well, I think they performed it once or twice since. Now, the shows received standing ovations at both performances. And when fans demanded an encore, Pete Townsend told the audience that they were too tired after two-hour performances. This elicited a boo or two from the crowd, to which Townsend retorted, "After 2, naughty word, hours, boo to you too." In the November of 1970, Keith Moon was in Bournemouth jamming with the Beach Boys. He'd always fancied himself in a surf band. He was in the Beachcombers, remember. Now, the seeds of Tommy go back to that plane journey in 1967, inspired Glow Girl, and this particular recording has a Track Records commercial at the end of it. And this is where Tommy began back in 1967. This is The Who with Glow Girl. The final part of the show takes a look at one of the great lost albums of the 1970s, Lifehouse. It had a very short life. Rehearsals started at the Young Vic in early January, and on the 13th of January 1971, the project was announced to the press. And following a handful of performances and a New York recording session, the 26th of April saw the final performance at the Young Vic. And Townsend abandoned the project shortly afterwards. Now, Lifehouse was a complex follow-up to Tommy. Universal Studios were behind the project. It was intended to be a movie with live footage and lots of audience participation, which is what they were filming at London's Young Vic Theatre. The futuristic storyline was set in a post-apocalyptic, polluted, mind-controlled world, where the hero attempts to provide freedom through rock and roll. Great concept. The climax came with a freedom concert, but thwarted by the state. The concert goers and some of the mind-controlled people who tuned in, well, they simply vanished into thin air. And the project never really gathered a head of steam. It just fell apart, really. There was some studio recordings with organist Al Cooper and guitarist Leslie West, and they were recorded at the record plant in New York. But some of the material was salvaged from the wreckage of Lifehouse, and that turned up on Who's Next. That was released on the 27th of August in the UK. It's produced by John Glynns, and it was the first time the Who had worked with him since My Generation. But some of the tracks salvaged from Lifehouse is some of the Who's best work, I think, with Baba O'Reilly, Behind Blue Eyes, Won't Get Fooled Again, and a bit of a change of scene, as it were. In 1973, in January, Pete Townsend arranged and performed at Eric Clapton's comeback concert at the Rainbow Theatre. Now, Lifehouse might not have come to fruition, but Pete Townsend was still hungry for another rock opera, and he gave us Quadrophenia. Sadly, that had problems of its own. I mean, the problems really started with the initial release of the album in October '73. Pressing problems meant that it didn't actually hit the shops for another week, and that was after the Quadrophenia tour had started. I mean, Quadrophenia is all about the clashes in the mid-'60s between the scooter-riding mods and the leather-clad rockers. Very interesting time in British rock and roll history. They played the opera for the first time on the 28th of October in Stoke-on-Trent at Trenton Garden. And the premiere didn't go too well. They had problems with backing tracks. The band was under-rehearsed. But to improve matters, well, in an attempt to improve matters, 3 songs were dropped from the set. The Dirty Jobs, Is It In My Mind, and I've Had Enough. And the Quadrophenia tour sort of lumbered on, but it still wasn't going smoothly. It reached Newcastle at the Odeon Cinema on the 5th of November, and that was really when the tour reached a new low. Pete Townsend stormed off the stage. They were still having problems with backing tapes. Pete Townsend's frustration turned to rage. He hauled soundman Bob Pridden onto the stage, and in a fit of rage, he smashed his guitar and sound equipment before storming off. Now, the others followed, but they did return shortly afterwards. But they decided to abandon Quadrophenia in favour of playing some old favourites, which was probably much to the relief of the audience that night. Things didn't go much better when the tour reached America. They opened at San Francisco's Cow Palace, and the tour was actually called Fallout Shelter in America. But this is the one where, quite famously, Keith Moon collapsed on stage twice. And after the second time, Pete Townsend asked from the stage, "Can anybody play the drums?" Well, 19-year-old fan Scott Halpin could. He was from Muscatine, Iowa, and he took to the stage, and for the rest of the night, he was the Who's drummer. And they were supported that night by Lynyrd Skynyrd. They also had a bit of fun and games in Montreal. After the Montreal gig, they very nearly missed the next gig. It was down in Boston. The record company had arranged an after-show press party, and the usual sort of high jinks and obligatory TV in the swimming pool rock and roll fun ended in them all ending up behind bars and a local police cell. Well, jumping forward to 1976, 21st of October, that was Keith's last official concert. It was at the Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto at the end of their North American tour. He did actually perform again with The Who a couple of times, but both were for closed audiences for the filming of the movie The Kids Are All Right. But on a happier note, on the 23rd of June 1977, Keith Moon joined John Bonham on stage, where this was Led Zeppelin's ill-fated 1977 American tour. And it was at the LA's Forum when Keith Moon jumped on stage, accompanied Bonham on his Moby Dick drum solo, and he gave Bonham's timpani drums a very, very enthusiastic beating. But his final performance came on the 25th of May 1978, nearly 2 years after his last concert performance, and this was the second of those gigs for the closed audiences for the filming of The Kids Are All Right. And very strangely, the last album with Keith, Who Are You?, was released in the August, and the record sleeve very eerily shows Keith Moon seated on a chair which was inscribed, "Not to be taken away." Wow. Sadly, Keith died on the 7th of September, shortly after the album was released, and the previous evening he'd attended the film preview of the Buddy Holly story with Paul McCartney. And after dining with Paul and Linda, Keith and his girlfriend Annette Walter Lax uncharacteristically returned home early. Now, the following day, he died from an accidental overdose of tablets. Ironically, they were tablets he was taking to combat his heavy drinking. Well, the coroner returned an open verdict, quotes, no evidence of intention, open verdict. And one of the final twists of fate here was that the London apartment he was staying in was owned by his old drinking buddy, Harry Nielsen. And in what can only be described as a very bizarre coincidence, Mama Cass Elliot had died in the same London apartment 4 years earlier. Well, by the middle of 1979, the Who were back on the road with Kenny Jones in the drum seat. But what is absolutely fabulous news is the Who are on tour. And you can see them in the USA, Canada, over to the UK, back to the USA and Canada, between the 7th of May and the 23rd of October. Now, you can find very specific dates and venues on my website, rockandrollandravel.com. So for details of where you want to try and see them, just go to the website. It's called the Moving On Tour. And what they're going to do, they're going to have a local orchestra join the band at each gig. So that should be fun. It's billed as an evening of music from their entire career. And the lineup's Roger and Pete, with guitarist Simon Townsend, Pete's younger brother, keyboardist Lauren Gold, bassist John Button, and drummer Zach Starkey, Ringo's son. It's not actually billed as a farewell tour, and there's an album of new songs on the horizon. All fabulous news for Who fans. Well, that's it for another show. I've been Derek Shelmerdine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unravelled show on the history of the Who, the Keith Moon years. I hope you've enjoyed listening to the show half as much as I have in putting it together. If you're into social media, you can find me on Twitter at RNR Unravelled and Facebook at Rock and Roll Unravelled. And if you can see a theme developing, remember you can win a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unravelled. That question again, who did Keith Moon replace as drummer in The Who? To enter, simply go to my website, rockandrollandravel.com, go to contact, send me an email with your answer, and the winner will be announced on the next show on the 3rd of June. And I'll be posting the book to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Good luck with the competition. Well, I hope you can join me next time for another look at a little piece of rock and roll unravelled. Well, to play us out, The Kids Are All Right was the title of the movie that turned out to be Keith Moon's final performances. It was originally a single, produced by Shel Townley, written by Pete Townsend. It was their last hit on Brunswick, and it gave them a number 41 in the autumn of 1966, and with some trademark drumming from Keith Moon. This is The Who, and The Kids Are All Right.